Okay, shall we get started? Good morning, everybody. I'm Dr. Tina Axup and I work for the Educational Psychology Service, and I'm delighted to welcome Angela Greenwood this morning for our webinar. During the webinar, if you'd like to just put in any comments or questions on the questioning and answering feature, please do so, and then we'll spend the last few minutes trying to answer those questions and commenting on them. So feel free to interact with the talk. So I met Angela probably 20 or more years ago, and she was Senko at Porters Grange Primary School. And she's been quite pioneering throughout the area using therapeutic approaches with children. And as she saw need at Porters Grange to support children in this way, she went and trained to be an educational psychotherapist. And since then, she's been working in various settings using a therapeutic approach to teaching and learning. So first of all, I just want to welcome you, Angela, and thank you for coming on our webinar today. And thank you for all the work you've done in Southend for all these years and wider. Angela has recently written a few articles linked with the situation we're in right now with the COVID-19. And she's also put lots of her ideas into a really useful book for professionals. So it's a really great manual for people working with children and using this kind of approach. So first of all, Angela, there's probably people out there that have no idea what an educational psychotherapist is. So I wondered if you could just say something about that and about that approach.
Right, well, first of all, I want to say thank you. Thank you for including me and being so supportive. I've obviously worked with your team on and off over the years. It's a real privilege to be part of this. And educational psychotherapy. Yes, it's a psychotherapy, and it's got, I suppose, two strands. It's a clinical training, so you work one-to-one as a psychotherapist with children, but it has an educational bias and an educational interest and focus even in the psychotherapy. In other words, it uses stories and learning tasks and takes an interest in learning blockages, inhibitions, and difficulties that children might have in school, including behaviour difficulties, which can be quite common in schools these days. I've worked in various settings, in domestic abuse and pupil referral unit. And as I say, educational psychotherapy is based on psychodynamic thinking and understanding of attachment. So I suppose it has a relationship-based approach. And another thing that educational psychotherapists often do is liaise with schools and teachers and consult about children that are puzzling and challenging teachers. And so I've done lots of training. And so I think I will be drawing on educational psychotherapy thinking, which you can find described on my website and on the Caspari website in this talk.
Yeah, and for teachers out there, recently we put the Caspari training up on our website. So if you're interested in this approach and training in this approach, it's there. So if you want to go and have a look, because a lot of people that train to be educational psychotherapists are teachers.
Yes, I mean, I think you used to have to be a teacher or an educational psychologist. I think they've slightly loosened it, but definitely you have to have an educational background, yeah.
Yeah, and my understanding is that it's about noticing how children present and then trying to interpret what might be happening for them and then working with that. And I just wondered, with this strange time we're in, what you feel educational psychotherapy has to offer, that kind of thinking. What does that have to offer children and families and educators at the moment?
Right. Well, one of the things that we do in the educational psychotherapy training, the same in other child psychotherapy trainings, I think, is we focus on observation and noticing. And so the teachers, school staff, parents can do this, noticing at the behaviours, noticing how the child is presenting, what their difficulties are, and wondering. So it's noticing and then wondering and reflecting inwardly on what they might be feeling, what they might be communicating, what their difficulties might be about, not necessarily about being right, but just about wondering. And then reflecting on how we might respond to that in a thoughtful, empathic way. And then joining with them, really.
I'm thinking that sounds a really great way forward, but it might be quite difficult for adults at the moment, because not only the children might be in a state of anxiety, but also the adults.
Yeah.
And I know educational psychotherapy and your work has a lot to say around that relational aspect of that, how emotions can be passed between family members and people in the classroom.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Yes, it is particularly difficult at the moment because, well, all of us are affected by this virus and this time of isolation, and even doing things on Zoom is something I've never done before. And these things can make everyone anxious. The difficulty is, I guess my work is more oriented towards what I describe as vulnerable children. They very often have had a history or experiences, maybe severe health difficulties, or maybe some difficulties in the family. Not that it's anyone's fault, but that these things reduce resilience in everyone and can make it more difficult. When you're stressed, it's more difficult to be able to stop and think. But if you're aware that you're also stressed, everything, I guess, can be talked about. And with young children, everything is played through. And that's how children process things. That's how we all process things. We find a friend to talk to if we've got something on our mind very often. But of course, if we can't talk about it, then it tends to get acted out, maybe either internally or in getting sick or something, or externally in relationships. And so you can develop vicious cycles in families or in school relationships, actually, that, teachers can find certain children quite irritating. And it's not that the irritation is wrong, but it's being aware and then stopping and thinking. And one of the things with teachers and also maybe family members is if you can talk it through with other people, you can sometimes get a fresh understanding or a fresh way of thinking about it, or just feel a little bit of support in the difficulties that you're facing with a child.
And it's quite powerful to think that this approach might enhance immune systems, like rather than reacting to things, like lowering stress levels by just taking that few minutes to notice your own feelings as an adult and then responding to the young person rather than just kind of acting out of your own fears or worries.
Yeah. I think that's why I feel so strongly that I want to promote this relationship-based way of approach and reflective way of working. Because if you can stop and reflect, if you can just stop, firstly, and I think Nicole's webinar on the brain and also using breathing, the sort of techniques that you get perhaps through mindfulness can be very helpful to enable us to actually stop and take that moment to reflect and just slightly shifts our state. And then we can perhaps talk to others. And it is a little bit about going outside our comfort zone sometimes, because some families and some people tend, because of their history perhaps, or just because of their genetic makeup, to find talking through feelings more difficult than others. And then there's other families who probably talk too much and get too caught up in it and can't stop. So just to stop and become a little bit aware and to share with each other, and also to share with the children, to be available for the children. But this is another problem at this time, which is that many parents are actually working at home. And I'm very aware of that because my own son and daughter, they and their partners are working at home all the time, and the children are at home, and so they're actually not available. And so sometimes the child will need the support, but the parent is busy, maybe on a phone call or something, and actually can't support them. But afterwards, you may have a chance to talk about that. And sometimes you can prepare the child beforehand, say, look, I'm going to be doing this, but I will be available at this time. And I think it's not about being perfect. One of the things I really wanted to bring up was Winnicott's idea that we just have to be good enough. We don't actually have to be perfect. In fact, he even advocates being attuned to the child on the third time, because the conversation about the fact that you weren't available when you said that you were going to be available, or maybe you said, or your irritation perhaps might have been communicated a little bit. If you can talk about this with the child and say, oh, I'm really sorry, I know I said that I would be available at this time, but somebody phoned and I absolutely had to answer it. How are you now? Perhaps we can have a chat now. This sort of repair is actually very health giving, and it could be an opportunity which you perhaps hadn't had before to talk things through with children and to become aware of the value of that.
And that idea that mistakes can be good if they're dealt with in the right way, which kind of brings to mind the whole growth mindset approach in learning as well, that learn through mistakes, and it's important to be able to take risks. And you know, adults taking the risk of apologizing to a child or kind of talking things out, you know, can be really a useful tool to kind of develop that resilience and that relationship.
It's reminding me, in the school setting, I was involved in another book called Taking Children Seriously many years ago. And a friend of mine, Kate Ashby, wrote a chapter. And there's a little passage in the book where she talks about a little girl, I think she was 6, and I think she was answering a question and she got it wrong. And my friend, who was the teacher, made a whole lesson, probably about 10 minutes conversation about how wonderful it was that she'd made a mistake. She'd had the courage to speak about it. And now we can learn through our mistakes, and we can all learn through our mistakes. And thank you so much to the little girl who had made this mistake, because we can all think about the value of making mistakes and thinking again and talking things through.
And it is that kind of getting away from that pressure of getting everything right. And I'm just aware as well that people at home don't have the support of friends and extended family in, you know, they may have virtually on the phone or Zoom, but you know, actually in person to just take the children and be with them. So the children are kind of stuck in probably quite a narrow group of people. So that is it's easy, isn't it, to get on each other's nerves if you're just whereas that can be dispersed with grandmas and grandpas and you know, aunts and uncles and friends.
I really sympathize. One of the things which I emphasize over and over again in the book is the importance of empathy, and not just trying to say, to reassure or to sort of brush over the difficulties and talk about solutions. It is really, really difficult. And it's the same in our relationship with children. The first thing is to empathize and not to rush towards a solution, to really know that we hear what they're saying. And particularly at this time, I was just thinking about maybe the more vulnerable children who've experienced some trauma, because trauma can have effects on memory, concentration, tolerance of frustration, resistance. All these things can be heightened. And what we can see is that children can actually regress to former modes of managing, I suppose. I mean, I've noticed in my 6-year-old grandson, he's sometimes regressed to a sort of earlier behavior of rushing around and roaring like a dinosaur. It's just sort of a way of letting out the anxiety, I suppose. And so to see your child regressing and to understand that it's a stressful time for all of us. And so that will cause sometimes regression, and it will cause difficulty concentrating when they're supposed to be doing schoolwork, and it will cause an increase in resistance. Well, the difficulty is knowing what to do about it. But the first thing is to understand. And I'm not giving lists of exactly what you do. I suppose we do our own thinking, but we understand, and then we reflect on, and we share that understanding in small doses with the kids. They won't be able to take lots of words, but just as they're open, and think of creative ways forward, perhaps, or alternatives. Maybe we should stop for a while and have a drink, have a break, and try again, or change and read them a story, etc.
Yeah. And of course, stories can be used, can't they, to
definitely
kind of bring out those ideas, and, you know, using the metaphor to support children in understanding what's happening. It's very powerful.
I had a story. It was just like a video story, like a book, sent to me the other day about this time of coronavirus and isolation. It was wonderful. I don't know if I'll be able to share it with the world, and maybe one day it will be published, and about the opportunity, I suppose, of a little bit more space. We don't have travel time, a little bit more time to rethink.
And I wondered, I remember we were talking about how children with different styles of relating
Yeah.
may react in different ways, and it might even be that in the same family. And I wondered if you perhaps could talk about things that parents and teachers might notice about young people in terms of how they might respond, and then how you might respond to that.
Yes, there are different patterns, and sometimes the same child might even show different patterns at different times, but children can very often, and families can very often have particular patterns they tend to revert to. And there's an avoidant pattern, which is a difficulty with close relationships. I mean, I've noticed this too in one of my grandchildren, that he found it extremely difficult to look at me. In fact, he couldn't look at me when they walked past the house and they stopped to say hi from the street, and he just curled up into his mum and he just couldn't look at me. And that was quite painful for me to see, but I think that was sort of a regression into feeling safe with his mum, and also he's got out of the way of being able to manage, and I've got a really close relationship with him. So some children are avoidant, and the way to approach that is in very small doses, relating to, and also not giving up. We can tend easily to think, well, I can't do anything, I just feel helpless, but not giving up, keep trying and relating to them in small doses. And then there's another...
That could make you feel quite rejected.
Yeah, definitely.
So therefore you become avoidant of that interaction.
Yeah, and that's why you can tend to give up, and teachers can tend to give up. So being aware of that pattern, especially for school staff, is really important, because you do have to put a little bit more effort into relating to those children. And also there may be the sort of children who bury things when they're older, and then they might come out in psychosomatic behaviours or symptoms. So it is important. And then I was going to talk about the resistant ambivalent pattern, the sort of children who they seem to be very, very needy, and maybe for very good reasons. Their parents perhaps have been a bit preoccupied or needy themselves, and so they find it very difficult to feel held in mind, to feel thought about when they need it. They might feel thought about when the parent or the teacher needs it, but they really find it very hard to feel thought about. And so the thing to do for them is lots of holding in mind, like remembering what we did yesterday, what they like, what they said, what they told us, little signs like this or like this, that we're thinking about them. And also giving them short-timed tasks or short-timed intervals when you're not going to be available, and then coming back to them when you said you would. And if you can't manage that, talking about the fact that you didn't quite manage it and you hope that they didn't feel forgotten, etc. Because they really need lots and lots of experiences of feeling held in mind to be able to overcome this difficulty which they have with that. And then, of course, there's the ones who are quite chaotic and all over the place for very good reasons, probably. And so they can just become very hyperactive, even aggressive. And this can be very difficult for parents. And they really need to be aware that it's difficult and it's not their fault. And they need, as you say, to stop and think and try to calm down. I mean, one of the things that I've made some lists which can be popped up on the website is a calm box of things which are helpful to calm children down. I call them left brain activities. When you go out of the sort of emotional side, what we call the right brain, into more problem solving, fixing type games like jigsaw puzzles, dot to dot pictures, little questions, fixing things together, Lego perhaps, which calms you down because you're focusing on the task and you're getting out of your fizzing around feelings. You won't be able to do this when they're having an outburst. It needs to be when you can see that they're getting a little bit bubbly, or afterwards when they're calming down. Or the sort of relaxing techniques which Nicole was talking about, you know, deep breathing, various sort of relaxing exercises which can help you to calm down.
Have you got any thoughts, Angela, about the thing that is on everybody's mind? The fact we don't know when things are going to start to return to what they're calling the new normal, and you know, how children are going to cope with going back to school.
I think it's going to be very difficult for school staff. Yes, I've just written an article and I was talking about collapse for school staff, because it's not going to be easy for them. They are going to need our support. Some children will probably bury it and appear to be fine, and others will probably revert to their very reactive patterns, and that might be difficult. But in every case, understanding and talking through is really important. And in the school setting, there will be some kids who will be very open to talking through, and others who will find it really difficult because that's not something they might have done. They haven't been in school and they haven't talked things through with their teacher for a long time, and so they might find that difficult. And so I was thinking, in a group setting or circle time, that the ones who are finding it difficult will benefit, because they will hear other children talking things through, and they will hear the teacher sharing their own thoughts and helpful suggestions with the children. And you could even talk it through with a puppet. You could have a puppet in the center of the circle. Perhaps this is probably for younger children. And for older children, maybe through writing. They could write stories of characters that are stuck on an island, and I'm sure teachers
would... maybe.
Drama would be great, yes. Yes, I really like the idea of circle time and little bits of drama acted out in the middle. And then children can come and put their hand on one of the actors and speak the feelings that they're observing, and some other child, and the teacher can also model speaking the feelings of the different characters.
So we've had a question, Angela, come in that talks about, which is quite a good one for an educational therapist, I think, because it talks about like the busy curriculum and how that kind of approach of like reflecting and responding can be part of that busy classroom life with all those pressures on the curriculum.
I'm just wondering if this question refers to the busy curriculum that they're expected to do at home with their parents, or whether it refers to the busy curriculum in school.
I guess it could be both, but I think it's probably around school and when the children go back. But you know, but I think noticing, you know, where educational therapy notices how children approach learning might weave those two thoughts together. But what do you think about that?
Well, children won't learn if they don't feel secure. They need a secure base. That's part of attachment theory. And if they don't feel secure, if their minds are coping with anxiety or fear or discomfort, it will be very difficult to learn anyway. And maybe as a whole, as a nation, there is something we can learn here about not filling the time so manically with having to take in so much stuff. Because the other thing is, as you say, integrating the reflecting and the thinking and the noticing with the teaching and with the learning. Maybe slightly less expectations, and having the relationship in mind, and having the feelings which are being communicated in mind. And it doesn't have to take a lot of time. It could just be the odd comment. I suppose it's sort of a bit like a mindset. You talk about the growth mindset, but you could have a reflective mindset or a noticing mindset in the back of your mind at the same time as you're teaching. And actually, I talk about hot opportunities, which is taking an opportunity when something is actually happening in the classroom or in the home, which is observable in a child. And when you talk to one child, even if other children are finding it difficult to communicate, the children nearby will hear that. And so lots of children will benefit from these odd comments. And Winnicott talked about responding to children in small doses. That's probably all they can manage. And I'm aware that I'm saying a lot. So
no, I mean, that's great. And I've had another question up here about parents worrying that their children aren't engaging in homeschooling, that they're just losing motivation. I've certainly got friends like this who say, you know, especially teenagers, they're not interested anymore. Perhaps it was something that was quite interesting at the, you know, a novel at the beginning where you could learn over the internet, but now it's just gone on and on, hasn't it? And maybe it's more difficult.
Yeah.
So have you got any advice for those parents that are probably feeling
it's difficult, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, you might be able to think of creative ways around that. I think to put the observable, particularly if they're quite observable, feelings and behaviours of kids first. And the relationship has to be first. If you end up having a row with a child, because especially if you have repeated rows because they're not doing their work, that's going to have a severe effect on them, possibly long term. On the other hand, you don't want them to miss out on their learning, but there might be other ways, using film, video, reading stories to the younger ones on a regular basis, getting them to read books, just whatever they can do. I think when they get back into school, they will have difficulties. It will be go up and down, probably a bit like mourning a loss. You know, it'll come in waves, but they will get back into the routine, because routines are very helpful. And for parents, I know of one family where her child actually had severe speech and language difficulties, so severe that she went into a special school. And now the mother, because she's not working, is able to give a lot of time to the homeschooling and has a very, very strict routine. Not all families will manage this, but she is managing it. And her child with speech and language difficulties is improving heaps because she's getting one-to-one attention within a very structured environment. So every case will be different. It's difficult to say what is helpful on an individual basis.
So really it's an approach of flexibility, but with some boundaries.
Yes.
It's that balance, isn't it? Which is quite hard to strike,
yeah,
but
yeah.
Using children's interests, maybe if you can't do exactly what the school are asking, you know, to maybe be a bit more creative, because obviously there are lots of children that's very separate home and school in a very, like we probably might not want to work from home and kind of like to keep those two things separate.
You could almost see for some children, well, I think I've talked a lot about tuning into them. One of the things which, it's not just in educational psychotherapy, but all sorts of therapeutic approaches, is seeing behaviour as a communication rather than as something that we have to manage. I think schools tend to think about managing behaviour and tend to use reward and punishment systems, particularly reward systems, which do work with very secure children and they can work quickly. But with the more vulnerable ones, they want the rewards and maybe get them for a little while, but they can't sustain it. And in the end, it can have a negative effect. And also it's outer controlled. So something else which is really important to foster with all children, and I think very often children get this naturally in secure families, is for people to take an interest in their inner world, their interests, their growing up, they're themselves as people, I guess. And I think when you only have reward and punishment, that is outer controlled. It's not fostering inner control. So to say things like, well, I noticed yesterday you really struggled with this, and now look what you've done. I think you're growing stronger. What do you think? It just validates that the child has their own thoughts and that there's a process going on which we can all notice. And it's not about, well done, you've done that really well, which is me judging you. But it's about thinking from the child's point of view, which is making me think of my original teacher training. I was trained very many years ago in the Plowden days when education was child-centred. And I think that that is so important, that we become child-centred and we try to see whatever we observe from the child's point of view.
Thank you. That's a really great place to end. I so appreciate you coming and talking to us, Angela, and we're so lucky to have you kind of locally and still doing all this fantastic work.
And I'm lucky to have you to be supportive and